The 1970s Australian car market raised a lot of expectations. Some of them never came close to being met. 10 of the decade's most disappointing, counting from 10 to 1. The one at the very top was designed in Australia, for Australia, beat the Kingswood and the Falcon in the most significant award of the decade, and was dead before most buyers had finished forming an opinion about it. That one still hurts. It's still ahead. Number 10. Leyland Tasman, 1970 to 1972. British Leyland built the Tasman specifically for the Australian market, developed at the Zetland plant in Sydney, with a 2.2-litre overhead cam six-cylinder and a body sold nowhere else in the world. That local development should have counted for something. An engine more technically advanced than the pushrod sixes in the Kingswood and the Falcon, in a car that had been engineered with Australian roads specifically in mind. The disappointment wasn't in what the Tasman was, it was in what it was never allowed to become. British Leyland's financial position through the mid-1970s ensured the Tasman story ended before buyer trust had time to accumulate, before word of mouth could carry the overhead cam argument across enough driveways to matter. The car arrived with genuine credentials and departed without recognition. The next car had a different problem. It was recognized everywhere, and the recognition hurt. Number 9. Ford XC Falcon, 1976 to 1979. The XC Falcon carried a specific weight going into showrooms in 1976 because what it followed had not been a small thing. The XB GT and the XA GT had given the Falcon name a performance dimension that buyers paid attention to. When the XC arrived from Broadmeadows in Victoria with the 200 cubic inch inline six across the volume range, and a GT program winding down rather than forward, buyers who had been watching the Falcon's development trajectory found less than they had reason to anticipate. The Cobra arrived in 1978, a 302 and 351 cubic inch Cleveland V8, hood scoops, exactly 400 produced, and for those 400 buyers the XC delivered. For the broader market that came for a Falcon and found the performance chapter shortened, the XC carried a gap between what the badge had been promising and what the showroom was offering. There were production reasons behind those decisions. Buyers waiting at the front of the queue experienced the result, not the reasoning. The next car had no performance heritage behind it at all, just a straightforward promise about economy that Australian roads turned into a different kind of disappointment. Number 8. Volkswagen 44, 1972 to 1974. The Beetle worked because the concept was coherent. A small, light car with an air-cooled engine behind the rear axle, cheap to run and easy to repair. The 412 took that same architecture and placed it in a full-size body competing against the Kingswood and the Falcon for the Australian family buyer. A proper 5-seat sedan, rear engine, rear-wheel drive, asking for a price that made the comparison with the domestic sixes unavoidable. The handling in a large sedan body, with the engine behind the rear axle, was not the same proposition as it had been in the Beetle, and the long-distance demands of Australian roads exposed the mismatch between the concept and the application. Buyers who chose the 412 expecting Volkswagen reliability in a family-size package found that the qualities the brand had earned in a different kind of car didn't transfer automatically to a larger, heavier one, doing a different job at higher sustained speeds. The next car's disappointment had a more precise cause, a single engineering decision that the brochure didn't explain. Number 7. NSU Ro 80, 1970 to 1977. The Ro 80 looked like the future. A twin-rotor Wankel engine, front-wheel drive, semi-automatic transmission, and an aerodynamic body shape that most mainstream manufacturers wouldn't catch up to for another decade. The engineering ambition was genuine and well-directed in most respects. The specific failure was the apex seals, small components at the tips of each rotor that maintained the compression chambers and were faster than the rest of the engine's design anticipated. Complete engine rebuilds became necessary at mileages that no buyer of a sophisticated prestige car expected to reach. NSU made goodwill arrangements for affected European owners. In Australia, where the Ro 80 arrived in small imported numbers through specialist channels, the support structure for that conversation was considerably more modest. Owners who needed an engine rebuild were managing the cost and the logistics at a distance from the manufacturer that made both significantly harder. A car that had the shape of the decade ahead, grounded by a component the size of a thumbnail. The next car's disappointment was more public, written into the country's record in ways that haven't faded. Number 6. Chrysler Centura, 1975 to 1978. Tonsley Park had been building Valiants since the early 1960s. What it built in 1975 was something the Valiant's buyers hadn't asked for, and the compact segments buyers weren't waiting for. The Centura was a mid-size rear-wheel drive car based on Chrysler's French Simca operations, positioned between the Valiant range and the Japanese alternatives. The gap the Centura was designed to occupy didn't quite exist. While a 2.0-litre four-cylinder was offered, Tonsley Park engineers famously crammed the massive 245 and 265 Hemi 6s into the lightweight French body. Valiant buyers wanted that power, but the heavy engine gave the Centura terrifyingly nose-heavy handling. When Chrysler's Australian operations transferred to Mitsubishi in 1980, the Centura was a discontinued model with French-sourced components in a parts network that had moved past it. The disappointment here was structural, a product aimed at a market that had already made its decisions before the car arrived to compete for them. The next car's failure was more specific, more public, and is still talked about. We are halfway through. From here, the cars on this list carried more weight, more investment, more expectation, or more accumulated national trust behind the name on the badge. The one at the very top had all three, and the gap between what it was supposed to be and what happened to it is the widest on this list. Still ahead, number 5, Holden HJ Kingswood, 1974 to 1976. The HJ's disappointment is specific to one thing, and it's not the car itself. The HJ was a sound, dependable, well-developed family Holden, built at Elizabeth in South Australia and Dandenong in Victoria, a 173 or 202 cubic inch straight six, refined interior presentation over the HQ, and honest family practicality. The disappointment arrived with the oil crisis of 1973 and the Japanese manufacturer's response to it. By 1974, the Corolla and the 120Y were demonstrating what fuel economy in daily family use actually looked like, and the straight six in the HJ, entirely adequate for the conditions Australian family motoring had presented before 1973, was now being evaluated by a standard the decade had introduced mid-race. The HJ had done nothing wrong. The terms of the competition changed the year it arrived. Family buyers who filled the tank in 1974 and compared the cost against a Corolla owner in the adjacent driveway were asking a question the HJ's 173 cubic inch six had never been asked to answer. The next car was carrying a more personal kind of disappointment. Number 4, Ford XA Falcon GT, 1972 to 1973. The GT Falcon had been building towards something through the HK, the XT, the XW, and the XY Phase 3. By 1971, it had reached a development point that the Australian motoring landscape had not encountered before. Then the newspaper campaign arrived. Public pressure about the speeds production performance cars could achieve, the threat of government legislation, and all three domestic manufacturers pulling back simultaneously. The GTHO Phase 4, planned for the XA platform and already in development, was set aside before it could be built. What the ZAR GT delivered instead was a 351 cubic inch Cleveland V8, genuine performance, front disc brakes, a competitive and capable car by most measures. What it wasn't was what the Phase 3 had been leading towards, and the buyers who had been following that trajectory knew it from the first week. The ZAR GT is a very good car. The disappointment is in the car that should have come after it and never did. The next entry's disappointment was more visible from the outside. Number 3. Ford Capri, 1969 to 1973. The Capri deserves a specific kind of acknowledgement for the gap between its visual statement and its ownership experience. Available in Australia through Ford dealers, a European fastback coupe assembled locally at Ford's Homebush plant in Sydney with a 1.6-litre four-cylinder or a 3.0-litre Essex V6 in the GT specification, a genuinely attractive car at an accessible price, aimed at the buyer who wanted styling and some driving character without stepping outside a realistic budget. The V6 GT was the version buyers who read the specification sheet most carefully were drawn to. What that engine offered in practice was a heavy, unbalanced front end that the fastback body's nimble promise hadn't prepared them for. The massive cast-iron V6 in a lightweight chassis produced nose-heavy handling that made the car a straight-line bruiser rather than a European corner carver. The Capri's styling remained exactly what the showroom had promised. The rest of it was a more complicated experience. The next car carried a much larger national story and a much harder final chapter. Number 2. Leyland P76 1973 to 1975. The P76 did not fail in the showroom, it won there. Designed in Australia, engineered at the Zetland plant in Sydney for the specific demands of Australian family life, the boot size to fit a standard 44-gallon drum, a 2.6-litre inline-six, or a 4.4-litre V8, priced directly against the Kingswood and the Falcon. Wheels magazine named it Car of the Year for 1973. That result, a brand new car from a manufacturer with no prior history in the Australian full-size family segment, defeating the established domestic leaders in the decade's most significant annual recognition, is one of the more remarkable outcomes in the country's motoring history. And then British Leyland's global financial collapse arrived at Zetland. Production ended in 1974. Fewer than 18,000 P76s were built in total. The buyers who had chosen one, on the basis of the Car of the Year award, on the basis of what the engineering represented, on the basis of a genuine argument that Australian motoring had produced something new, those buyers were left with a car that would receive no further development, no follow-up model, and no ongoing manufacturer support in the form that builds long-term owner confidence. The potential the P76 demonstrated was real. The car the country got to keep was a glimpse of something that never finished arriving. The one at number one is the deeper version of that same story, told in a body style that almost no one knew existed. Number 1. Leyland P76 Force 7, 1974. If the P76 sedan is the decade's most painful what might have been, the Force 7 is what it feels like when the possibility is physically built and then stopped before it can be properly counted. Leyland designed the Force 7 as a fastback coupe variant of the P76 platform, built at the Zetland plant in Sydney, carrying the 4.4-litre V8, with a body that made a specific and serious visual argument for Australian motoring as something capable of producing its own distinctive sporting identity. This was not a concept study, it was a production car. Orders were placed, deliveries began. Fewer than 100 were completed before the financial collapse that had ended the sedan's story reached the coupe as well. Some of the completed Force 7s were sold and survive in private hands. Some were destroyed before they left the plant. The ones that remain are among the rarest production cars this country has produced, not by design, but by the abrupt end of the company building them. The P76 sedan, for all the difficulty of its story, earned a place in the national automotive memory. The Force 7 didn't get far enough for that to happen. Most people who follow 1970s Australian motoring in detail don't know the coupe existed. The few who do, and who have seen one, tend to go quiet about it. There is a specific quality to the disappointment of a car that was built, that was real, that got close enough to name, and then ran out of road before it could find out what it was going to become. That is the decade's most complete version of Still Hurts, and it belongs at the top of this list. Disappointment in cars is proportional to the ambition behind them. The Marina's failure was modest because its ambition was modest. The Force 7's failure is permanent because what it was attempting was specific and real and unfinished. These 10 represent the 1970s Australian market, at the moments where the gap between what a car was supposed to be and what it was allowed to become tells the most interesting story. Some of these cars are remembered with genuine affection despite the disappointment. The P76 owner who still drives theirs, the Z's GT owner who knows exactly what the Phase 4 would have been. That combination of affection and unresolved what if is what the decade left behind more than any other. Which of these still sits with you? The one you owned? Or the one someone in your family did? Or just the one whose story you can't quite set aside? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if Australian motoring history is what brought you here, a like and a subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome keeps it coming.